So this is why MCQs and rhetorical analysis, and I guess argument also, go hand in hand, because ultimately what we're looking at is an author making an argument and what consists of that argument and what are the methods they use to make that argument effective. Again, pretty much like rhetorical analysis, right? Thinking about why a work works in its presentation altogether. So think of it like traditional essays. There are topic sentences, there are body paragraphs, and within them, we talked about this like really early in the year, right? Like they're all basically the same things that we do here. There's going to be a point per paragraph. There's going to be information within that paragraph and just explanations within those paragraphs there. So don't like, when you're reading these pieces, don't feel like you're going to be overwhelmed by them. Don't feel like they're kind of like completely alien to you. Sometimes the language is a little bit tricky, but otherwise, all you got to do is like, okay, the point. What is this paragraph largely about? Okay, what information is it giving me? Okay, regarding the information, how is this author explaining it to me there? Once you have that down, every paragraph just pretty much is the same, just with different, content, right? But the approach is usually the same for the most part. And so all we got to do is do like a quick summary to figure out what these authors are saying in these respective works there. So this is the pragmatism one. There are, what is it, like 11 questions to us here? 44 to 55. And for this one, we're going to think about the strategy we talked about last time here, right? We're going to look at the little italics. We're going to think about how to approach every topic sentence and to get a big idea as to what this piece is possibly about here. So I'm looking at the little italics. It says the following is accepted from a recent nonfiction book. Okay, nonfiction. So it's not going to be anything like narrative. So we're not thinking about maybe dialogue or weird kind of writing choices that are a little bit more personal. It is a book, a nonfiction book, so it's not like a fictional thing where it's like a storyline, whatever. It's more about like presenting information, right? So the topic sentence technique will probably work in this one as well, because it's just, again, an argument and then the divulging of informations to us there. So if you want, you can take your time to go through the, what is it, 6 paragraphs? I think there's five paragraphs, and to go through them yourself and to see how well you understand each one, to like, kind of read the topic sentences, chunk them down, and like, figure out what they're largely about here. And once you've done that, you can follow me in the next slide here, which I'll cover in just a moment. Here we go. And you can kind of like double check your answers, your findings with my answers as well, right? So for me, the paragraphs, what I've read was, the first one's about the basis of a decision making. Meaning this whole first paragraph talks about like, from where do our decisions come from? What is something that's pragmatic and not? So it talks about things like choice, explaining pragmatism, how people form their own beliefs and ideas, efficiency as a topic as well, pragmatism versus utilitarianism. So just thinking about like, from where does our thought process exist, essentially there, right? Which is the main premise of this entire piece altogether. Number 2, author goes on to talk about how it's not easy to make decisions. Decisions are what we think, right? And so they use like everyday examples to kind of like examine why we might make certain decisions altogether. So the thing is, we think like, oh, well, everything's based off of logic. Not really. Actually, most humans operate off of like emotions, right? And feelings and prior beliefs. So in this case, authors kind of like, it's a little bit more complex than that for paragraph number 2. For paragraph number 3, talk about thinking altogether, the framework for thinking, and the thought process of making a decision. So they're kind of like, it's kind of like logos in a sense, right? Where it's like step-by-step processing and figuring out like why certain decisions are made versus other ones there. Number 4, different types of decision making. And the thing is, it becomes more complex, right? Where you have to choose the right decision and follow through with it. Thinking makes it real, meaning that sometimes a decision is more based off of maybe like, again, pragmatism, something that's the best choice of them all, or maybe out of like morals and ethics within that, situation altogether. And the author in the 5th paragraph, from what I read, was maybe there's no right answer. Maybe it's just how we feel, right? That maybe ultimately it's just trying to maximize happiness and upholding values as the key things there. And there's nothing more past that. Maybe that's what pragmatism is ultimately. Kind of like, if anything, it just feels right. So this whole piece, if I had to summarize it, just talks about how like choice hard because there's a lot of choices to be made in life. So what I want to do is want to break down some of these questions here, figure out how the answer is right due to these reasons and how I got to it through POE, process of elimination. And we usually use process elimination for the ones that you're really unsure of, right? You don't have to process elimination everything, but it's a good habit to do, because when you do process elimination, what you're really kind of practicing is the sort of like logic game of why this versus the other ones. That is correct, right? And so what I want to show you is 2 examples of POE in action, and to think about like, okay, how do I really know it's right versus the other 4 options there? So let's start with 44, right? The very first one is 44, and the question was, by saying pragmatism is an account of the way people think, we're looking at lines 1 through 2, the author implicitly acknowledges that, all right, we gotta like break this question down because the language is a little bit tricky, right? So the thing is, author of the very first line says pragmatism is an account of the way people think. And by well, not definition, but by explanation, what that line basically means is that what we think is as pragmatism is practical stuff, right? Practical choices. They're simply accounts of different people and kind of like collectively what we think is right through trial and error, through various examples, and kind of building up a general framework there. And by saying this first line, the author implicitly acknowledges, meaning that in this first line, the author is suggesting, right? We had to figure out which one it is then, A through E. So let's look at the answers and why they are not. By the way, the answer is B for this one, but we'll see why it is versus the other. So the first one says, the thinking process is probably impossible to comprehend intellectually. That's not true, because what this author does is pretty much trying to, again, approach the thinking process in an intellectual way. They're using like anecdotes, they're using, not anecdotes, I'm sorry, they're using, well, I guess anecdotes, yeah, like kind of like little cases, right? Little situations in real life here. And so in this case, it can't be A because the author is approaching it in a way, what do you call it? They are approaching it in a way that is intellectual. C, he is skeptical about philosophical explanations in general. That's not true. I mean, I think in the fourth or fifth paragraph, they talk about the philosophy of it all, right? The sort of like intrinsic nature of happiness that goes with our choices as the best possible choice, right? So I don't know. This piece isn't really skeptical. I think it's informative rather than opinion for the most part. It's just kind of like throwing information out for us and making or allowing us to make our decision on our own, right? D, pragmatism has come to dominate current philosophical discourse. Not really. That piece doesn't really talk about that either, nor does this first line suggest that. And lastly, pragmatism can reconcile differences among belief systems. No, actually, the author kind of suggests that there are a bunch of different belief systems and that pragmatism, well, it's just a documentation of different people's approaches, right? So in this case, I don't think you reconcile. I think it's not really, I think it's acknowledging that there's differences, if anything, and that it's okay to be different in terms of thought process altogether. So it's going to be B, right? In this case, there may be other theories that explain the way we think. So the reason why it's B is the author says is an account, meaning that it is simply based off of like different observations and examination he does, right? So in this case, he's implicitly saying that there might be other ways to approach the way we think. And the question also, again, says implicitly, the author acknowledges. So we have to infer that, right? We have to kind of think like, well, what do you mean by that? What are you suggesting by saying that pragmatism is an account of the way people think? I know the explanation is kind of tricky to it all, but this is what you gotta do when you're kind of like processing MCQs. You gotta think about like why one answer is not correct versus the other options given to you altogether, right? And I have to admit, this one's a little bit on the harder scale, I guess. I think that on a 1 through 10 scale, this one's maybe like a high 7 in terms of readings, though. I don't think there's just like an absolute 10, but I mean, saying a 7 is, a little bit more on the upper side, right? So with process elimination, we're going over 45 as well. In the first paragraph, lines 1 through 21, the author is mainly concerned with. And so we're going to think about like, okay, well, what is the author concerned with? What is the author largely dealing with as the main kind of focus, right? So the answer is A for this one. So that means that B through E are not the right answers there. So first paragraph, author's concerned with B, defining what we mean by thinking. Not really. He's not really defining that, right? If we go back to the first paragraph here, in this entire first section, all he's really doing is talking about like how through example, this whole like lobster and steak thing, right? That we oftentimes go into our tastes, we go into our judgments, we go into our what do you call it? I guess feelings in decision making there. So it kind of like observes the situation, and it kind of brings about the question of like, why do we do the things we do essentially there? So we go back to the question again. Define, nothing's really being defined here, right? It's just kind of like jumping into this whole question and having like these brainstorms about thinking and choice making. C, establishing his own credentials as a thinker. No, he doesn't do that. D, presenting a personal account of pragmatism. It's not personal, it's more of an everyday example, so in this case, it's not quite D. E, describing two sharply different points of view. Not really. The author does kind of like suggest that there are different ways we approach situations, but they're not two sharply different points of views. It's just kind of like the different ways we might approach something given circumstances and situations. So, A, distinguishing between two frames of reference. In this case, if you look at this one here, author is talking about how there is usually two ways we approach things, right? One being the, what do you call it? The logical way of life, I guess, right? Like price or nutrients or whatever. And then the other one is more of the subjective stuff, right? So if anything, the author is really talking about objective and subjective in decision making in here. So it would be A, the two frames we work off of, as the language suggests, taste, judgment, right? Subjective, objective, in that case there. So for 44 to 55, I have the answers here for you to consider and to think about like why each one is the way it is. I just want you to go through them and see if you can kind of like, figure out why you got them wrong and right, and to just practice that process of elimination, right? To go through each one and to think like, well, it can't be this one because of this. It can't be this one because of this. And just thinking about like why the other options as a whole cannot be the right choice. A little story about this too. So it's a good exercise, by the way, to do this whole process elimination thing. But I remember like back in the class of 2020, I think, and I think they cheated on it on one of these like MCQs here. And as a punishment, what I did was I made them explain why every answer that was wrong has to be wrong. So usually people only want to look for the right answers, right? They'd be like, oh, 45 is A, 46 is B. So, they only look for like, that one letter and move on. So I did the reverse there. I was like, all right, well, if you don't want to lose all your points and basically flunk this exam here, I want you to explain why the other four are wrong there. And it's a big old packet they turned in because it wasn't just one single passage. It was like questions 1 through 55, right? It was like all of them. So fun times, but it's good practice. It's good to do process elimination. Maybe not that much at once, but just to do it time to time.